Yes, the relay on YouTube. Check it out. Lots of stories about me on there. All the boxing facts and info that you want in a very entertaining, educational manner. The relay. Check it out on YouTube.
Welcome to the motherfucking relay where we're covering today's top boxing news.
Okay, we'll start with this. Well, this weekend, up-and-coming lightweight prospect from the UK, Chantel Cameron, is going to be squaring off against CANELO. The winner of this fight will become Katie Taylor's WBC mandatory challenger. And this is a fight that I touched on in previous videos. But now we're going to break this thing down. We're going to get down to brass tacks. What is likelier to happen than not when both of these girls enter the ring and square off against each other? You might notice that Cameron-Basheel, she's got a record of 8 wins and 5 losses. One might wonder, how does someone with 5 professional losses end up getting to compete, to vie for a world title in this situation? Well, let me shed some light on that. You know, Cameron-Basheel, she actually lost her first 5 pro fights. That's how you can explain that. She lost her first 5 consecutive fights, but she has since bounced back. You know, after losing those 5 fights, she has won 8 in a row. 8 fights in a row, all by way of knockout. Ow! So if you were wondering how does someone with a record like this get this kind of an opportunity, there's your answer. Cameron-Basheel has bounced back, and you know, for what it's worth, she's bounced back in a big way, because anyone she's ever beat, she's knocked the fuck out. She's won 8 in a row, and that has led her inexorably to this point, squaring off against one of the UK's best prospects. Wham bam, Chantel Cameron. So these are just my thoughts. You know, both of these girls are power punchers. I mean, that much is obvious when you watch them in action, that the both of them pack a sizable punch. But one of these fighters is simply more refined than the other, more well-groomed, and comes from a better pedigree than the other fighter. And that fighter is Chantel Cameron. That while they're both power punchers, Chantel Cameron doesn't compromise her defense to get off her power shots, whereas Cameron-Basheel does. She lunges in and hyperextends, and her chin is just out there for something to come back at her when she commits to those power shots. So in doing so, she leaves the door open for her to get put down, and I think that could happen in this fight. I think that what could happen and what will happen is that Chantel Cameron is going to go out there and she is going to outclass Cameron-Basheel because she's simply the more well put together fighter in the fight. We often talk about the value of compact punches. You know, what luxuries that affords to a fighter that can effectively implement compact punches, that these are punches that are short, sharp punches that are defensible, that when you fire them, there's not too much worry of something coming back at you because the punches are defensible. Whereas in the case of Cameron-Basheel, you could fit a living room couch in between her punches, and that opens the door for something to happen to her. That opens the door for someone to slip and hook.
Do some damage.
Someone like Chantel Cameron. Someone who knows how to go upstairs just as good as they know how to go downstairs. You know, sometimes she might catch an opponent with a left hook to the body at the end of a combination that starts off with a lead right uppercut. It keeps the opponent guessing, this variety of punches, that you never quite know where they're going to come from. And so long as the opponent doesn't know, that increases the likelihood of them getting hit with a shot that they didn't see, a shot that they didn't prepare for. And ladies and gentlemen, it's the shots that you don't see that hurt the most. You think about the footwork of Chantel Cameron. You understand how she keeps herself in a power position to land punches, that she knows to take a half step back when she smells a counter coming, only to bounce back into range and fire off a shot of her own while her opponent is open, while the opportunity presents itself. You think about the fluidity of Chantel Cameron, that this all comes together as one ensemble. You understand that it's not labored. This comes naturally to Chantel Cameron. And what I see is that Chantel Cameron stands a good chance of winning this fight, but not just winning this fight by way of a technical knockout. I think that Chantel's going to show the cleaner work, she's going to land the more consistent punches, and she's going to force a referee stoppage. Both girls pack a punch, and both girls are very aggressive, but one of these girls is just a more well-rounded, more versatile fighter with more variety than the other. So I'm going to go with Chantel Cameron to win by way of technical knockout in the mid-rounds. And you can look for this one on ESPN Plus this Saturday. In other news, Michael Benson tweeted that Eddie Hearn says he'll likely make his own offer for Callum Smith versus Billy Joe Saunders, but not yet, as he doesn't think the fight is as big as it should be. His plan is for Smith to have 2 more, then target Canelo next May, or an Anfield bout, possibly against Billy Joe Saunders. Essentially, Mr. Eddie Hearn is putting a unification fight for Callum Smith about 2-3 fights out. So the time frame we're looking at for just such a matchup is upwards of a year's time. And I'll be completely honest when I say that, no, I don't like the sound of that. If you're planning on putting a year between now and then for a Billy Joe Saunders versus Callum Smith fight, that begs the question, what is Callum Smith going to be doing in the in-between time, and who's he going to be doing it with?
Exactly.
Just as well, what effect does a decision like that have on the weight class overall? You have to realize that the super middleweight division doesn't have a star. Callum Smith may be the consensus number 1, but he's not a household name. Not yet. And if Eddie Hearn plans on staging such a matchup a year from now, then what's the division got to offer? You know, we know that the other 2 world champions at the weight, Anthony Durrell, Caleb Plant, they just so happen to be on the same side of the street. So maybe something could be orchestrated between them. Well, that is if Anthony Durrell can even hold on to that title, which I don't think he can, because he's going to have to defend it very soon against David Benavidez. I don't see Anthony winning that fight. I just don't. Better still, 2 of the belts, I should say, are on the same side of the street. So something perhaps can be negotiated there to spice up the super middleweight division. But, you know, those are PBC fighters. And we all know PBC will drag their feet for a while before they decide to make something happen, something major. So we see this, and you know, I got to be honest that I don't like Eddie Hearn's, I don't like his decision. I'm not for it. I think that if you really want to make Callum Smith into a somebody, you've got to match him against Saunders. Who else have you got? You know, we know that Daniel Jacobs is talking about moving up to 168 pounds. He's talking about entering that weight class. So that does kind of seem like a possibility. Maybe a Daniel Jacobs versus Callum Smith fight stateside to raise Callum Smith's profile with the Americans. Yeah, it's possible. You know, if the American public, hypothetically speaking, of course, because I'm not forecasting the outcome.
Not yet.
Mostly because that fight hasn't been made. It's not even being talked about. Better still, hypothetically speaking, if a Callum Smith versus Daniel Jacobs fight were to come off, you know, on Jacobs' end of it, that would afford him the opportunity to become a 2-division champion, him having been the IBF champion at middleweight. This would afford him a shot at not only the WBA title, but the Ring Magazine belt as well. So there's something in it for him. And on Callum Smith's end of it, it could boost his profile. It could raise it, because we've seen Daniel Jacobs in there with the likes of Canelo Alvarez. We've seen Daniel Jacobs in there with the likes of Gennady Golovkin. So just imagine if Callum were to beat him in more spectacular fashion than they did. I'd say that could give him a considerable profile boost. So there are possibilities, you know, if Danny does go up there and if such a fight is orchestrated. But ladies and gentlemen, everything I just mentioned is hypothetical. We don't know that that's what they've got in mind for Callum. So that does beg the question, what do you guys have planned for him? If you don't want him to fight Billy now, because the fight's not as big as you want it to be, then what do you got planned for the guy?
For the next 3 fights.
You think about Eddie Hearn's verbiage, you know, that the fight's not big enough. I see where that is coming from. You see, this is a cross-promotional, cross-network situation, you understand. For everybody to get what they want, this would have to be a sizable fight, or more sizable than it is here today. So I get that. I understand that. It's just that I don't see too many avenues for you to improve Callum's profile against interesting opponents, because, you know, in all honesty, the super middleweight division doesn't have a superstar. So what are we looking at? Are we looking at Callum Smith versus, you know, I don't know, possibly a David Lemieux, possibly a Daniel Jacobs, someone like that? These are fights that can be orchestrated and featured on DAZN, because all those guys, they do fight on the same platform. But I am left wondering, if you don't think now is the right time for that fight, then what are you going to have this guy doing? Don't let him turn into one of these guys that's waiting for Canelo Alvarez to prioritize him, waiting for Canelo Alvarez to give him a call, waiting for Canelo to do something, and making Canelo the focal point of your efforts in regards to Callum Smith. Don't let him be that guy, because we see what that's done for Andrade. We see what that's done for Jermall Charlo, and more recently, we see what that turned out to be for Gennady Golovkin. Don't let Callum Smith be one of those guys who's trying to make Canelo the focus of all his efforts. The networks, the promotional outfits, they have their interests. It's not hard to understand why Eddie Hearn might not be crazy about sending his guy not simply to another network, but the rival network, to fight under a rival banner against a rival champion. I mean, this is all domestic beef. That's what we're talking about here. That's really what it is. I get that. I understand that. But just as well, look, the division needs it, and the fighters need it, and the fans want it. So I can only hope that Eddie Hearn has something in particular in mind for his fighter, because what could happen is Callum Smith could end up on the receiving end of a lot of backlash due to this decision that, so you don't think that the fight with Saunders is big enough? So who are you about to fight? Please tell me it's someone of comparable value. Please tell me you have something interesting in mind for this fighter, because if you don't, and the very next time we see him, it's against another guy like Hassan Endam, who was a fish out of water at super middleweight, by the way. But if the very next time we see him, it's against that caliber of an opponent, you know what people are going to be saying. You know they're going to call it a duck.
Some people.
I mean, there are very few boxing fans out there that are capable of looking at the whole situation and assessing it with a level head. The vast majority of people are going to have a precedence to call it a duck, and they likely will, when this shit really hits the fan. So I sincerely hope that Eddie Hearn has something, interesting in mind for his fighter, because if he doesn't, and he goes in there against another Endam,
Instead of Saunders,
people aren't going to take too kindly to that. And, this, in many ways, exonerates both Billy Joe Saunders and Frank Warren of any culpability in the event that the next time we see Billy, it's against some unheralded Shafat Isufi kind of an opponent that, you know what, you can't blame him for it because they tried to make a big fight. They tried to extend an olive branch. So you can't blame him if he can't get a big fight. I mean, this is a big part of the reason that I felt all these months ago that Billy Joe Saunders should have just went ahead with that fucking Andrade fight, because Andrade is a more interesting opponent than anything that will be available to you at super middleweight. You understand? The interesting guys are on other sides of the street. You don't have immediate access to them. Whereas what Queensberry Promotions has for you, it's just, a lot of people aren't going to be clawing at their faces to see more Shafat Isufi kinds of opponents. I feel that the most interesting thing that Billy could have did at that time was, fight Andrade. Why not? People are going to be more interested in that than seeing you fight some unheralded guy for a vacant title. The only way going up to super middleweight would have garnered any real attention is if Saunders would have been challenging Zerto for his belt. But Zerto moved up. He vacated the title. We all know what happened. It then became available for Billy to win it, and he did. But guess what? Nobody cares. It's a mess, man. It's a mess. And finally, I'm sure that most of you have heard already that Canelo Alvarez has announced that he's not going to be fighting in September as he normally does. A tweet posted by Steve Kim reads, Golden Boy announces they have made a strategic decision to postpone their typical September Canelo fight. The decision was made in an effort to secure the right opponent and to do justice to the level of promotion required for a big boxing star of this magnitude. On Canelo postponing his customary September date, DAZN wants the third Triple G fight. Canelo wants to wait till next May. Triple G and his team believe they are getting it this September. It will be interesting to see how this plays out. Steve Kim also went on to say, here's reality. If Golden Boy and Canelo were still doing pay-per-view and working off percentages and buys, they could fight whoever they want and live with the financial consequences. With DAZN putting up guarantees, well, that changes things. So let's address that first. How does DAZN guaranteeing Canelo Alvarez these sizable dollar amounts? How does DAZN guaranteeing him sizable paydays every time he fights
Guaranteed.
change things? Well, it's not hard to see. It's not hard to deduce. They're not guaranteeing. I mean, the key word here is guarantee. You understand? Canelo's not relying on fans who may or may not buy a pay-per-view to finance his payday. You understand? That's not his problem anymore. And there are virtues to that, but there are also drawbacks. Now, the virtue of it is Canelo is guaranteed a sizable amount of money whenever he fights. He stands to make a substantial amount of money guaranteed. The key word here is guaranteed. But it is a trade-off. DAZN's not gonna pay you these sizable amounts of money to kick any old fucking can, you understand? They want to make sure that if they're gonna give you these millions upon millions of dollars, it's going to be for big fights, in big events, against interesting opponents, not just any old body.
Like
that
you.
limits the pool of options for Canelo Alvarez. You can't fight just any old body. It's gotta be a good opponent, it's gotta be a good fight. And it's for this reason that they're postponing this thing. But there's more to it than just that. You see, based on this move, I'm of the opinion that Canelo Alvarez is no longer interested in campaigning as a middleweight. That's how this reads. There is at minimum, one option on the table that could have seen Canelo Alvarez fighting in September, and that would have been in a Gennady-Golovkin rubber match. DAZN wants it, and Golovkin wants it. But Canelo, he's just not interested. One has to ask why. We already know he's got away with judges, so why doesn't he just go, quote-unquote, beat him again? Why doesn't he go do that? And I think it's because he's no longer interested in campaigning as a middleweight. All the news that has been coming out suggests that Canelo Alvarez means to leave the middleweight division, move up, and move on. And that may be to the chagrin of Gennady Golovkin, and it may be to the chagrin of DAZN, but that seems to be what Canelo wants to do. There have been names like Callum Smith at super middleweight, names like Sergey Kovalev at light heavyweight, and in December, provided Sergey is successful in August against Anthony Yard, in December, we could perhaps see a fight between Canelo and Sergey. That's how this reads. That's how this looks. Now, we know that Sergey's going to be in action before the end of the summer. He's going to be squaring off against Yard in August, towards the end. And let's say that something happens to Sergey Kovalev. Let's say he gets hurt. Let's say he gets cut. Let's say he gets beat. And for some reason or another, he's not available to fight in December. What does Canelo do then? Because I'm not convinced that he'd want to fight Anthony Yard in a situation like that if Yard were to upset Kovalev. So what would Canelo do? I'll tell you what he'd do. He'd fight fucking Callum Smith. Didn't Callum Smith's trainer make that suggestion? That they would be willing to fight Canelo in December. I think it was something along the lines of they're not sure about a September date, but a December date, they'd be willing to do that. Didn't they say that shit? I mean, essentially, the door is not closed for Canelo Alvarez to orchestrate a sizable situation in December. But if he's made this decision to not fight in September where he normally does, it's because, well, quite honestly, he's not interested in campaigning as a middleweight anymore. That's why. The only guys available to fight on that date are guys that are at or around the middleweight division. And Canelo seems to have done all he means to do at that weight. He's not interested in Golovkin. He's not that interested in Andrade, even though they were saying that he was. He just doesn't seem interested in doing anything anymore.
At 160.
Not there. So if he's made this decision, I guess the inference we can make is that the next time we see him, it may not even be in the middleweight division. And those two world titles that he's holding, he likely could vacate them at some point between now and then.